such a vitally important issue, and I think that's why you're here. It is the issue that probably supersedes everything else, simply because if you at the next election to the voters, they're not going to listen to you. And that's why we're here. It's a very important issue because it affects every other issue that they vote on. So what I would like, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking. Most of you know me and you listen to me all the time, whether you want to or not. So what I want to do is introduce you to the man who started this whole thing that is now in the Supreme Court. And he has a lot of information to share with you, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions for him. So I want to thank Sachin Cheda for being here today. I've been messing up his name all day long, but we're going to get it because he's such a nice guy. All right, thank you, Sachin.
Thanks, Jeff. So Wendy, do you know everyone here? Everybody knows Wendy? All right, so Wendy Sue Johnson is an attorney here in Eau Claire, former member of the school board, but most importantly, a plaintiff in Whitford v. Gill. So we're going to do this together to some degree. I'll start off and then we'll be handing it back and forth. Thanks so much to all of you for being here. I really appreciate it. And I want to say one thing, Jeff, I appreciate the credit. I'm one of the people who originally got together around a breakfast table after well, I'm going to tell that story in a minute. But I really want to give a lot of credit to State Representative Fred Kessler, former NAACP and Milwaukee President James Hall, Bill Whitford, and attorney Peter Earle, who were the other kind of original founding members of the Fair Elections Project, and our co-chairs Tim Cullen and Dale Schultz, former state senators. So I don't want to hog all the credit. So let me start here. So we're going to talk for about 40 minutes or so, and we'll take some questions. Obviously, our goal here is to talk about map rigging and ending partisan gerrymandering. And I want to start by talking about the day after the election. Now, I'm going to guess, I don't know, and I think there's probably a little bit of diversity of political opinion in the room, but it might lead one way. And so I think people, whatever side of the political aisle you were on, you might have woken up the day after the election a little surprised, right? How many people here were a little surprised the day after the election? And I want you to keep your hands up if you were surprised. Now, I want you to think about it. Were you disappointed? Were you happy? It's okay to say so. All right, keep your hands up if you were still surprised. All right, I can see up here. Now, I'm talking about the day after the 2012 election. Gotcha. And so I want to set the stage for the 2012 election, because we're not talking about the 2016 election, we're talking about the 2012 election. And so let me actually go even a little further back so I can talk about 2012 and talk about 2010 a little bit. Now in 2010, we had fair maps for the 2000s. And we had an election in 2010 and the Republicans won a pretty big victory. They took the governor's office from a Democrat who held it for 2 terms. They won a U.S. Senate seat that the Democrat in that seat had held it for 3 terms for 18 years. And they won majorities from the Democrats in the state Senate and the state Assembly. They got about 53% of the statewide vote in the aggregate in the Assembly, and they got about 60% of the seats. They got about 250,000 more votes than the Democrats did, right, in the state. And they got 60 seats on one side. The Dems got 39, so there's 99 seats in the state Assembly. Now this is a rational result, right, because the Republicans got more votes and they got more seats. And that actually is how democracy should work, right? So then we fast forward to this day that I was talking about, the 2012 election, and a sea change happened. Now again, it doesn't matter what side of the political aisle you're on, I'm trying to stick to facts. There was a lot of tumult in Wisconsin in 2011 and 2012, right? There was a controversy over collective bargaining rights for public employees. There were significant cuts to public education funding, right? There were a lot of issues that there was a lot of political discussion about. And the politics of the state, there was some reaction to that, right? The governor was recalled, he won his recall election, but the signatures were gathered. There were 9 state Senate recalls, and in those recalls, in the summer of 2012, the Democrats actually took the majority back from the Democrats took the majority back from the Republicans. And then in the fall election of 2012, the Democrats won a big victory. They won the presidential race in Wisconsin. Barack Obama got 7% more votes in Wisconsin. Tommy Thompson was running for Senate. He'd been a longtime popular governor, and he was beat by a liberal, out-lesbian congresswoman from Madison, Tammy Baldwin, which, I mean, if you lived through that at the time, many of you probably did, lived through the Tommy Thompson years, that's a surprising result, right? For a very left, comparatively, politician to beat someone who was arguably the most popular politician in Wisconsin, kind of in the modern era. And the Democrats won a big, significant majority in the legislative vote to kind of counteract what happened in 2010. They got about 170,000 more assembly votes than the Republicans. So add those two together, that's a 420,000 vote swing. Now there were about 2.5 million voters in that election. And the swing of the vote was 420,000 votes. That's a pretty big swing, right? So you would expect, if the Republicans got a lot more seats in 2010, because they got a lot more votes, that would be the opposite in 2012. But, wait for it, the Republicans still had 60 seats in the Assembly, and the Democrats still had 39. There was a total disconnect between what happened in the electorate, right, and what happened in the legislature. And if elections are about accountability at all, and I'm not saying they're only about accountability, they're also about vision, they're also about candidates, they're also about partisan leanings. But if they're about accountability, and then the Republicans came back in 2013 into the legislature and said, hey, the people must have liked everything we did, because we're still here. We have the same huge majority, almost a supermajority, in the Assembly that we had before. We took the state Senate back from the Democrats, even though they took it away from us in the recalls in the summer of 2012, right? And so that was the narrative, that the Republicans were, kind of reinforced in what they were doing. And that wasn't accurate, because if we look at the votes, we can see that in 2012, the votes were actually different. And so what we know from that is something about the system being broken. This comes from 538.com. And if you look at this yellow funnel in the middle, what you're seeing is the number of swing seats in the U.S. House of Representatives over the course of 20 plus years. And in 1992, there were 133 swing seats, according to 538, in the U.S. House. That was about a quarter of the overall U.S. House. And so control of the U.S. House really was in the middle, right? You had to win a bunch of these seats to get to that 218 seat majority, right, in the U.S. House. And a lot of factors have made competition go down. But when we got to the post-2010 census, post-2011 redistricting, and we saw a huge increase in gerrymandering, we see that there's only 35 seats now that are swing seats. If you look at where this line is in the middle, the Republicans actually don't have to win a single swing seat to have a majority in the U.S. House. Not one swing seat. Only their leaning seats, only their strong seats, only their landslides. This is true in state houses all over the country, and it's true also in the Wisconsin State House. Now, a political scientist named Sam Wine and his colleagues made this chart, and what they show is over the decades, how many seats are affected by gerrymandering and who has been advantaged by it. In the 70s, the Democrats had about a 6-seat help from gerrymandering, and we'll explain what that is in a minute. Republicans had 1, so there's kind of a net gain of 5 seats for the Democrats. In the 80s, it was about 4 seats for the Democrats. Back to the 90s, it was about a 5-seat again. And then after the 2000 election, it switched. Remember, that was when George W. Bush was elected. And the Republicans got about 4 seats in gerrymandering, and the Democrats got 2, so the net advantage was only about 2 seats. But then we got to the 2010 census and redistricting, and suddenly there was a huge jump in the number of U.S. House seats that advantaged to the Republicans. In fact, the net of that is about 12 seats. If 12 seats swung in the U.S. House right now, the U.S. House would be tied. The entire advantage that the Republicans have in the U.S. House after the 2016 election is due to gerrymandering. All of it. So that tells you that we have a little bit of disconnect with what's happening in a 50-50 divided nation in our democracy. Now the consequence of that is where Wendy's going to come in, and she's going to take over as we go forward here.
So I'll just let you read the quote. elections, the general elections, don't really matter because the true contest isn't there. I believe that most citizens across the nation and in Wisconsin really are sick of the polarization, the divisiveness. And when you don't have competitive general election seats, but the only competitive race really is in the primary. And so when you're running in a primary for either party, that's pulling candidates to the extremes. And we've seen that with the Tea Party, and we've seen it really in the last election, with the Bernie folks. So we're pulling further.
That's not a criticism of anyone, it's just to say that we're moving the issues kind of to the poles of both parties.
So while most of us are closer to the center and want our elected officials compromising, having discussions, that's not what the system is set up to do. It's set up to pull people to the polls. Not POLL. So when I was on the school board, I actually really valued, there was one particular board member that I know didn't share my politics, but I really enjoyed having conversations with him because he brought a different filter. He brought a different perspective. He asked questions that I wouldn't think to ask, and he made points that I wouldn't think to make. And so when you're sitting in a room with people who all think like you aren't really examining issues in all ways possible. And that's a really valuable experience. And when I ran for school board, when it was contested races, like, this is good. This gives us an opportunity to talk about education issues. Because if there's 3 people for 3 seats or 2 people for 2 seats, nobody really cares. You're not going to come to the forum to find out what my ideas are about education and whether you agree or not. So, this book. So I actually had signed up for Twitter to follow my kids. You have to be on social media to know what your teens and 20-somethings are doing and where they are and what they're thinking. So I signed up for Twitter to follow my son. And then I read this book. Actually, Don Dexter gave it to me, his copy, and I now wish I would have just purchased one. The title of it is whited out because it's a little sensitive. It's RATF**KED. It's by David Daley, and it's not a hard read if you're at all interested in learning more about how we came to this gerrymandered reality. I would encourage you to read David Daley's book, but I got through the introduction, and that's when I started tweeting. I'm like, I am so outraged, it's like 10 o'clock at night, and I need to share my thoughts with somebody in the world, and I started quoting things from this book, from every chapter, and it covers, each chapter is a different state, and what it is a description of Red Map, the plan that a small group of Republicans decided that they were going to target state houses for the 2010 election so that they could draw the maps. It was intentional, and it wasn't like, oh, we're in power, I think we'll do this now. It was an intentional effort to put resources and energy into that. So read the book. So gerrymandering, you probably know about Governor Gerry in Massachusetts. He drew these districts that looked like a salamander, although Sachin thinks it looks more like a dragon. It should be Jerry Dragons.
I'm almost scared to think, if that's what salamanders look like then, I would have been very scared of salamanders. They don't look like that anymore.
So that's where the name comes from. And one of the arguments, actually, I sat through the 4-day trial last May, and one of the arguments that the state made on behalf of this Republican maps is that, well, our maps don't look like salamanders. And so therefore, it's not gerrymandering. Like, legitimately, that was their argument. And my 17-year-old son was like, that's all they got? Like, this guy is totally out of his league if that's the only argument he has. So they were in the past. And so it's not looking for funny shapes. It's the manipulation. I think the definition is probably next. Manipulating the lines for political advantage. So the particular group is drawing the lines so that they have an advantage in the election. And that's what Sachin described to you in Wisconsin, the advantage that the Republicans currently have. And again, this is a nonpartisan issue. In Wisconsin, it's the Democrats fighting against the Republicans, but in other states, the Democrats do it. And so the people, the lawyers and people that are working on a case are truly nonpartisan and fighting it against both parties.
So just to summarize, our concern is less about funny shapes. We're focused on misalignment of votes and seats, right? So that issue that was evidenced by the 2012 election results is really kind of what our focus is. And we don't believe, and as we studied this, we don't believe the Constitution requires proportional representation. What we learned is that what we think the Constitution does require is partisan symmetry. And that goes to this issue of if one party can get 53% of the vote, and that means they get 60% of the seats, then if the other party gets 53% of the vote, they should get 60% of the seats, right? The parties should be treated symmetrically. And when parties are not treated symmetrically, that means the adherents of one party or another are being treated unequally in the system. It means that in a state like Wisconsin, a Republican vote literally counts more, right? You need fewer Republican votes to get a seat. And in a state that's gerrymandered by Democrats, a Democratic vote counts more, right? And that's wrong. It's unfair. And in fact, what our case essentially alleges is that it violates the constitutional rights of individual citizens. So I talked a little bit earlier about the day after the election. And in about February of 2013, State Representative Fred Kessler gathered a group of people in a restaurant in Milwaukee and said, look, we can't live like this for the next decade, because we just prosecuted an election. We went out there with our ideas, we went out there with our candidates, we went out there with our message, and we won, and yet we're 21 seats down in the legislature. So we can keep fighting elections, but it's not going to do us any good, right? So what do we do about that? And that group of citizens got together in February of 2013, and we met for more than a year just because we chose to, right? Every 2 or 3 weeks, we'd get together over breakfast. We educated ourselves on the issue. We learned about the law. We learned about the Supreme Court precedents, and we tried to figure out what we should do about it. And we came to a simple conclusion that the majority should rule, right? That was the core principle, that rule of majority rule was being violated by these maps. Now, there are a bunch of traditional criteria around how maps are drawn. Traditional redistricting criteria. There are federal constitutional requirements like equal population. That's kind of a new one. That only came up in the 1960s. Voting rights also came up in the 1960s. There weren't a lot of federal rules about what the Constitution required until a series of civil rights cases in the 1960s. There's some state rules around having compact and contiguous districts and having minimal jurisdictional boundaries broken. You guys might talk a little later about Dunn County, for example, where that's broken. And we want communities of interest to stay together. So what we really had to figure out then is, okay, what are they actually mechanically doing? Because if we want to stop them from doing it, we had to understand, we knew that they had manipulated the maps. We had to understand how and why they manipulated the maps. I want you to understand this. We've got a little bit of an example. So the goal, as I talked about, is to misalign seats and votes. So you do two things. You pack voters and you crack voters, okay? Packing voters is taking one party's adherents and putting them in a district, as many of them as you can, so that that party gets like 80% or 90% of the vote in that district, okay? You're basically using up as many of those parties' voters as you can. And then you take the rest of their supporters and you crack them into districts where they have no chance of winning, right? So there's many fewer packed districts and there's many more cracked districts. And you can decide by drawing the map lines a certain way that you're only going to allow one party to compete for a certain number of seats. Let me visually illustrate this for you. And I keep walking in between this projector, so I'm sorry about that. So imagine I've distilled the state down into 4 districts that each have 16 voters. Okay? So there's 64 voters in our magic state of 4 districts. And And imagine that the citizens are divided between people who generally support the Purple Party and people who generally support the Green Party. Now, I know there's independents, but a lot of the data shows that the vast majority of independents who declare themselves independent vote most of the time for one party or another. There's very few people in the middle. So assume that there's a couple of people in the middle, but it's not going to change the math of this exercise. Now, if you split up those folks kind of evenly, then here's the effect of that. The effect is that the candidate matters. The campaign matters. The amount of energy they put in the campaign matters. So let's say in this top left district, we've got a purple candidate who's a really good candidate. And they convince some independents and some folks who lean the Green Party to come on over to that purple candidate. Then in that district, the purple candidate's going to win. The candidate matters, the campaign matters, the energy they put into it matters. In this district, the Green candidate is a little bit stronger, better candidate. They run a better campaign. They do a better job of connecting with their neighbors and talking about the issues. So in that district, they win. And you go on into each of these districts, the candidate that's going to win is the best candidate, right? Now, if we pack and crack the Green Party voters, we change the entire dynamic. So you look at the same population distribution on a map, and the same number of people, but you draw the lines in these shapes, right? You use this technology, and actually these three districts don't even look that weird, right? There's just one that looks a little funny. And we've packed a ton of Green voters into this district, an absolute ton. I think there's 12, let's see, 5, 14 out of the 16 voters there are Green. Now what I'll tell you about the Green candidate in this district, this little U-shaped district, is they're a terrible candidate. They're really inarticulate, they don't work very hard, they don't even shower that often. But you know what? You're not going to be able to peel off, even if the purple candidate's really good, they're not going to peel off enough Green Party adherents to win that race. The map has decided that the Green Party candidate is going to win that one race. And in these other districts, about 63% of the voters are purple, and 38% of the voters, 37% of the voters are green. And the purple candidates are okay. The Green candidates might be a little better, but it doesn't matter, because there's so many more Purple Party adherents. This map, I don't care who the candidates are, and I don't care how hard they work, and I don't care how smart they are, I guarantee you that the result of this election is 3 purple representatives and 1 green representative. The map has pre-decided what's going to happen. And that's what happened in Wisconsin. We have been packed and cracked. Republican and Democratic voters have been put in places in such a way that the legislatures decided for us what party is going to be in charge. And this is happening in states all over the country. Turn it back over to Wendy.
So, probably preaching to the choir here. So you know that before 2011, the city of Eau Claire was basically divided in half. We're kind of used to, the rivers, 54703, 54701, being, kind of a separate community of interest. The northern half of Eau Claire was with some rural areas in the 68th. The southern half of Eau Claire was with some rural areas in the 93rd. And, it was competitive. Those races went back and forth as, kind of the mood of the country and the quality of the candidates. And then the maps were redrawn. And you can get these maps on the state legislative website. And I have mine that zooms in. This tiny little jagged circle here is the new 91st that was drawn very tightly around the city of Eau Claire. We are a packed district because the citizens in the city of Eau Claire tend to lean left. And so we're going to pack all of them in. Why would you split them in half and let those 2 districts be swing districts when we can pack them in and then make those other districts lean right? Try to figure out, now, am I in the new 91st or am I in the 68th? I wasn't even sure because the line literally goes down my side street. And I don't think that I'm that important, but I feel like it's a bit of destiny. That I've gotten this rile up about it. So I'm in Dana Watts' 91st district. And I don't really even have to call or email Dana that often because I already know that he knows what I think, that he shares my values about school funding, and he so it goes literally back and forth. And so, like I was carved into the 91st, and then right across the North Crossing, Kathy Duex was carved into the 68th, and then, it literally goes back and forth, like right along the edge of town. Why is that necessary? You can still get the same number of people with a lot smoother lines. It does the same thing on the west side of town, and I got to go back and see what those addresses are, because there's some really odd ones over there. But that doesn't make sense. You're not trying to create even populations by doing that. So we were packed. This is me. I keep going. You guys know this story, so I'll be quick. People in other parts of the state don't necessarily know it. So I mentioned the school board. Back before Act 10, we followed the advice of the Wisconsin Association of School Boards, and we set up legislative meetings approximately quarterly. The Eau Claire School District partnered with Altoona and Chippewa, and we would rotate amongst the 3 districts, and about quarterly, we would meet with our local legislators, and we would invite all of them, and most of them would come, and we would sit down and we would talk about the issues. At the very first one, after that election, I remember Warren Petrick and Kathy Bernier and Moulton were all there and listening. Warren Petrick in particular asking tons of questions, trying to understand school funding. It's pretty complicated. And, there was a dialogue. There was, some uncomfortable moments. And Senator Moulton, had the sense not to share when he disagreed with us. But they listened. They were in the room and they listened. And we had a number of those over the years. And then in 2016, I came back and did a 6-month vacancy. And I attended my last legislative breakfast. And as it turns out, the last legislative breakfast, because our local representatives have actually now refused to meet with all of the school board members. So it was open to every school board, elected official, and then the superintendents and the business directors, maybe a few others. But now they refuse. They will only meet with, I think, the president and the superintendent. They won't have these general meetings. Because in this meeting, I was talking about an article by Kathleen Weinhaut where she was comparing the success of Minnesota to Wisconsin. In the same national economy, they're able to make choices in Minnesota and have a surplus and raise the money increase the money that they give to schools, and they're doing something different. And I looked across the table at Senator Moulton and Representative Petrick, and I said, do you ever ask yourselves, what are you fundamentally missing? And then I hear some rustling off to my left. And I kind of ignore it, and I keep making my point. Yeah, and I hear Representative Bernier mutter, kind of under her breath, but not all that quietly, this isn't relevant. And that made me angry, and I turned and I said, this is absolutely relevant. We are talking about school funding. That is the purpose for these meetings. You are creating a budget that affects us, and you need to think about what that does. And she got up. She took her things, and she walked towards the door. And Kathy Duex, bless her heart, moderate, very kind, there for the right reasons, says, now, Kathy, let's calm down, let's stay at the table, let's talk to one another. And Kathy Bernier says, I can't listen to this vile political commentary anymore. And I asked, some of the other board members and reporters, like, did I swear? Did I say something that was offensive? And then, as it turns out, nobody else thought it was vile. So she, I don't know if you read the Leader Telegram with Chippewa Herald, was on the front page for a couple of days, and I didn't really try to stir things up, but apparently I did. And the next day, she gives this quote to the Chippewa Herald. Talking to these people is worse than going to the dentist. She is talking about elected officials discussing the budget. So, I think that is the effect of gerrymandering.
So our view is now elections don't matter. They don't have to have this breakfast anymore, right? They don't have to be in a dynamic where they have to be held accountable to public discussion. And this is happening all over the country. Now, we've talked about legislators playing to the extremes, to the middle. There's also this effect of just bipartisan consensus breaking down. And we talked a lot about the character of Wisconsin politics, right? And I think a lot of you have probably followed politics for many years, many decades in Wisconsin. And we used to really have a reputation for clean government, and we used to have a reputation for being neighborly and coming together. And there's a lot of issues in which, if I talk about them in historical terms, you'll see that the fights were really at the margins of the issues. There was a bipartisan consensus that the University of Wisconsin system should be a world-class university system. You know, I fought, as a student activist, I fought Tommy Thompson on some stuff, but I'll tell you, every regent he appointed, every single one, no matter how conservative or how business-oriented they were, they believed the University of Wisconsin system should be a world-class university system. They wanted to recruit the top talent. They donated tens of millions of dollars to build buildings all over the state. It was something that we had a consensus about, and that consensus is now broken down. We used to have the best roads in the upper Midwest. You guys drive west into Minnesota. I live in Milwaukee, or south into Illinois. When I was a kid growing up driving south into Illinois, I wouldn't have to look up to know that I hit the border, right? I'd start going like this, right? And now it's like that coming back the other way, right? Our ability to come together to find ways to prioritize our infrastructure has completely broken down. Water protection is something that Republicans and Democrats came together on, right? The Wisconsin Conservation Congress is dominated by people who vote conservative. In fact, that's the root of the word conservation, right? They want to protect the natural beauty and the outdoors and hunting and fishing. That is what Wisconsin has long been known for. And conservatives are the ones who insisted that the DNR hire scientists to protect our environment, to make sure that we're making the best decisions. And now those scientists' jobs are being cut. The bipartisan consensus is broken down. And there's no accountability, and ideology has gotten to the point where it trumps progress. So, as this group worked, and I keep referring to this group of people, we now have been meeting for a year, we've figured all this stuff out, we're seeing the results in the politics of the state, and we've learned that what we can't do very easily is change the process by which maps are drawn. And we're going to talk a little bit later about our vision for how the process should change. We do want it to change, but citizens by themselves going to the courts can't change the process because we need the legislature, it's a legislative fix, right? We need them to actually change the process of who draws the maps to make that process fair. There's no voter initiative in Wisconsin, right? In states like California and Oregon and Washington State, the voters can override the legislature, right? They just gather enough signatures, they put a question on the ballot, and that has the force of law. If we want to put a question on the ballot in Wisconsin that has the force of law, only the legislature can do that, right? So they can only trump themselves. We can't trump them. So we decided that we had to have litigation, and instead of focusing on the process, we were going to focus on the outcome. We were going to try to get the courts to set a standard where fair districts should mean fair elections, and we wanted to make the general elections primaries. And we also realized, as we were doing this work, that even if we don't win a lawsuit, we can change the conversation. Now, we're on a nice summer night, and it's a little rainy, but the temperature's great out there in Eau Claire, and there's, 40 people in the room. I'll tell you, when we started doing this work in 2013, I couldn't have gotten 4 people in the room to talk about partisan gerrymandering, right? So our goal was to change the conversation and engage the public, and that's happening. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So when we realized we had to file a lawsuit, we had to learn about the law, right? And Wendy is a lawyer, and I'm not a lawyer, but I get to talk about this anyway. And when I talk to lawyers, this section of the PowerPoint has 20 slides. Those slides are not in the presentation. We're going to skip all of that. And I'm just going to tell you one thing, which is that there were a series of cases where excessive partisan gerrymandering was declared by the Supreme Court, by a majority of the Supreme Court, to be unconstitutional, but they never actually made a map, a specific map, unconstitutional, because they couldn't figure out what the standard should be. And Justice Kennedy, who was in the middle of the court then, in 2004, in a case called Veith v. Jubilaire out of Pennsylvania, he found himself in the middle. You had 4 justices on the left who said, this map is unconstitutional because it's too partisan, we should overturn it. And you had 4 justices on the right said, the court should never get involved in this stuff, it's up to the legislature, we don't care how partisan it is, we don't care how rigged it is. And Justice Kennedy in the middle said, well, I do care how rigged it is. I do think that there is such a thing as excessive partisan gerrymandering, but I don't know what the standard should be. So I'm going to be in the middle on this issue, and this was 13 years ago. So he issued an invitation, and the invitation reads like this. I would not foreclose all possibility of judicial relief if some limited and precise rationale were found to correct an established constitutional violation. That is constitutional legal speak for show me how to do this. That a workable standard for measuring a gerrymander's burden on representational rights has not yet emerged does not mean that none will emerge in the future. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge emoji. And so that's what he was doing in this case. So after we've been working for about 15 months, trying to understand all these things, we've been networking all over the country. And James Hall from the NAACP went out to New York and he met a law professor who was an expert on redistricting. And he said, you know, there's this new paper out by this young professor at the University of Chicago. You should meet him. And his name was Nick Stephanopoulos. And we invited him to breakfast in Milwaukee. And he brought along his girlfriend, because that's what you do when you're getting on a fun breakfast meeting in Milwaukee. And his girlfriend happened to be, now his wife, but at the time his girlfriend, happened to be the voting rights director at a nonprofit in Chicago. And they said, we have the standard. We have the standard that we think Kennedy wants to see from the Veith case. And we said, that's what she said, right? They said. And we said, well, we've got the facts. We can show you the election results. We can show you the secretive and process that they used to draw the maps. And so he'd written this article, and we figured out that there was a match. And that was in the summer of 2014. And then we had to work for another year. We had to raise money. We had to recruit lawyers. We had to recruit plaintiffs. So putting a laser on Wendy. We had to have these experts write reports. And it took a year, from July of 2014 to July of 2015. We used the standard that Nick had developed called the efficiency gap to measure that thing I was talking about earlier called partisan symmetry. Right? It's a mathematical test. And we filed a case. It was very exciting. We filed a case in federal court. And we said, we should overturn these maps. And it was originally called Whitford v. Nickel, then Whitford v. Gill. Actually, now it's Gill v. Whitford, but that's, what complicated. So, here's what we wanted. We wanted a 3-part test, and we wanted to base it on a similar test that's used in racial gerrymandering cases, right? So this is a partisan gerrymandering case. The Supreme Court has long said that racial gerrymandering is unconstitutional. There's a huge body of law. And that way we were being doctrinally incremental. Right? So this isn't revolutionary. We're not trying to make up, it's not activist judges trying to make up new law out of nowhere, right? It's about just tweaking the constitutional standard a little bit, applying a test that had been used in racial cases to partisan cases. And so let me tell you a little bit about that test, and I'm going to tell you a story about how important the evidence was and how important we had kind of the Wisconsin political history that we had. So the test was a 3-part test: partisan intent, partisan effect, and not justifiable. That was essentially the test. And I mentioned earlier that the Democrats took the state Senate back in 2012. Do people remember that? Nod your head like this or like this. Yes, people remember. There were 9 state Senate recalls, 2 seats changed hands, and that switched control from the Republicans to the Democrats. When the Republicans originally drew the maps, they hired a law firm and they hired some consultants. And they had 2 staff people from the Senate and the Assembly. The 2 Fitzgerald brothers were in charge. So 1 staff person, Tad and Adam, from each. And they hired a consultant named Joe, who was a former state legislator. And they went into a secret map room across the street from the Capitol at Michael Weston Freeman. They were the only 3 people allowed in the room. They were all taxpayer funded. They used taxpayer funded computers, but nobody could have access. And the lawyers said, our clients are the Republican leadership. The taxpayers were paying them, but they said the Democrats aren't our clients. We're only going to listen to the Senate's majority leader and the Assembly speaker, who were brothers, the Fitzgerald brothers. And so they're working away, and the Democrats are trying to get information about what's going on, and then a lawsuit is filed. Not our lawsuit, a different lawsuit, called the Baldwin lawsuit. Al Baldwin was a congressman and state representative from here in northwestern Wisconsin. And he led a group of citizens, like the group that Wendy's a part of. And in that case, they litigated a bunch of stuff, and nothing much happened. They changed the lines of 1 district, but there was a lot of discovery, and a lot of documents had to be turned over. And so then when the Democrats took control, they said, aha, we are your clients now. And they went to Michael Weston Friedrich, and they said, hand over the files, we're your clients. And we think there was a little bit of running around like, oh my God, what are we going to do now? But then the lawyer said, well, we'll just give them the files that we've already turned over in discovery, because this stuff's all already public. And they handed over a treasure trove of thousands of documents, and it turned out that when the tens of thousands of dollars, they excoriated them on the record, and they demanded that the hard drives from these computers be turned over to the lawyers and the Democrats. And so there was this moment where the hard drives were pulled out of these computers, they brought it to a law office, they set them on the table, they kind of backed away. The baldest lawyers came in, they picked up it was like a bad custody handoff. And they took these hard drives, and they took them to a former Secret Service analyst in Minneapolis. And they said, can you figure out everything that's on these hard drives? And some of the material had been deleted, but it hadn't been properly deleted. It hadn't been completely overwritten. And so they were able to spend tens of thousands of dollars. They had to raise the money.
The thing I remember about this story is that they actually tried to physically destroy one with like a screwdriver or something.
One was damaged because they illegally tried to literally erase it by like stabbing at it with a screwdriver. So, but enough of the data was saved. So now we fast forward. That case ends. There's some, fines are paid. Court complains. Nothing really changes. But the hard drives are now in the possession of these lawyers. Now, a couple of these lawyers, one of them was an original member of my breakfast group, and he started working with us just as all this stuff was ending. Another one was another lawyer, Madison, and they were both now working on the Whitford case, on the case that Wendy's on. So we're fast forwarding about 3 years, and they're preparing for trial in May of 2016, in April of 2016. And they're looking at all this data, and they're saying, you know what, how come our evidence, our discovery documents, don't have any spreadsheets from April of 2011? They passed the maps starting in May of 2011. How could they not have had any analytical spreadsheets for the map? So they go back to the Secret Service guy. Nobody's seen this stuff yet. And they just try to find us spreadsheets from April of 2011. And he finds a bunch of spreadsheets that had never been disclosed, not released in an open records. It had been asked for, but it had never been public before. And so at trial, we were able to talk about these spreadsheets. Guys are all rapt. Attention, and I'm talking about spreadsheets. Amazing. They started with the 2000s map, a map drawn by a federal court in 2001 that was fair when it was drawn. Democrats had the capacity to win a majority under that map, but it had grown more biased because of demographic changes over time to the Republicans. And when they started with that map, they said, look, we think the bottom line for Republicans is they're going to get 48 or 49 seats no matter what. So let's start tweaking that map. And they tweaked it. And so the first map was Joe base map basic, and then there was Joe base map assertive, and they got up to about 52 seats. Okay? And then they started, Tad had a map, and then Joe had another assertive map, and then they had an aggressive map. And this is literally the file name I'm reading off the screen here, Joe aggressive 1, Joe aggressive 2. Right? And they get up from 52 seats to 56 seats, to 57 seats, to 58 seats. And as they got to the end of the process, they got up to 59 seats, and then they started tweaking the map more, and they started subjecting it to what we call a swing analysis. They had a consultant from Oklahoma, actually a very honest guy. He's a Facebook friend of mine now, because he told the truth when we put him on the stand. And they would analyze what would happen if the electorate got more Democratic. What if the Democrats got more votes than they get usually? Half a standard deviation more, a full standard deviation more. What if the Democrats got more votes and had the biggest Democratic wave election that we've ever seen in modern times? More votes than the Democrats got in 2006 or 2008, which were wave years for the Democrats. What if they were a standard deviation and a half? More votes than the norm. And they just kept tweaking that map, and they made sure that they stuck at 59 seats, even if the Democrats got a massive percentage of them. And then the worst map that was the most biased, that was the most impervious to the electorate, was called the final map. And that was the map that they passed as Act 23. The judge who wrote the decision was appointed by Ronald Reagan, and he said, it is clear that the drafters were concerned with and convinced of the durability of their play. Because we introduced all this evidence in the trial. We put him on the stand. We put Tad on the stand. We put Adam on the stand. I don't know how Joe got away with not being on the stand. He must have left the country. Keith was deposed. We also then proved, and I'm sorry this is a little hard to see because it's washed out, but basically imagine there's a big line up here and a big line down here, and these are all of the redistricting plans in modern American political history. We hired an expert from Stanford University, who's now University of Sydney, political scientist named Simon Jackman. He got all the data for 800 redistricting plans across 50 years, across 40 states. This data was all publicly available, and he analyzed every single one of them. It took a year to do this analysis. And he measured how biased they were in two different ways. And one was, how biased was it over the life of the map, 10 years, life of the map. We were the 4th worst in modern American political history. And then he measured it just for the first 2 elections after the map was imposed, because that was more clearly showing the intent of the map, right? Because demographic changes change a map's bias over time, and we were the worst in modern American political history. Wisconsin Act 43 of 2011. Introduces evidence at trial, proof of partisan effect. What the judge says is achieve the intended effect and secure for Republicans a lasting assembly majority. We proved that the map could be done fairly, that the population distribution of Democrats and Republicans in Wisconsin is such that it is possible to draw a fair map. In fact, it is normal to draw a fair map. A guy named Joey Chen did an analysis where he randomly drew 1,000 maps, and not a single one was as biased as the map that they actually passed. Act 43's partisan effect cannot be justified by the legitimate state concerns and neutral factors that traditionally bear on the pre-court process. Judge Ripple, appointed by Ronald Reagan. So, this is where I had to take over.
Okay, sure. So, so if we win Whitford, it would be the map that we are using would be thrown out. It would be declared unconstitutional, and we would have to have a new map. It would have to be redrawn by the legislature, and if they refused to do it or didn't do it in a more fair way, then the court could impose their own map and take submissions from our attorneys or from other parties and whatnot. So it's about the outcome of our particular map. We're challenging just the Wisconsin map that we're currently using. So that's if we win. If we don't win, it's still, as Sachin mentioned earlier, we're talking about this issue. It's a platform for conversation. And in my email every day, I have things from the League of Women Voters and from Common Cause and Citizen Action, and everybody is talking about it. I was at the county board meeting, actually my first county board meeting that I've ever been at on Tuesday night when the Eau Claire County Board voted 21-4 to send a resolution to the state saying, you need to fix this thing. So we're having this conversation. We had a forum like this in Wausau last night with just as many people. I spoke in Marshfield a couple weeks ago. Sachin has been to Appleton and several in Milwaukee, and people have been all over the state talking about this problem. And so we've already won, in a sense, by having that conversation about what's wrong with the system.
But what actually happened after the trial?
We won!
This is where you applaud! We won!
So we were actually talking with Julian earlier today, and he said, I said, oh my gosh, I remember where I was, not when the Supreme Court took it, but when we won. I got a text, and then I got a phone call, and I was in the bookstore at the University of Kansas, looking at a kind of college tour for my son, and I'm like, oh my God, I want to jump up and down, but I'm in this bookstore, and for I don't want to, we gloss over this, but the other cases that the Supreme Court had ruled on had never gone to trial. They were at it on Monday. And, you know, it was tempered a bit by, they also voted 5-4 to put a stay on the map, on the remedy phase. So we aren't under the November 1st, 2017 deadline for new maps right now. But that could change. But more importantly, after kind of the press cycle, you know, took off on the fact that it's going to the Supreme Court, the clerk at the Supreme Court called our lawyers and said, hey, what do you do in the first week of October? We'd like to schedule this. And so the very first week of the session, the first week of October, which was weeks, if not months, sooner than we expected to be there, we will be in DC listening to this case. So we're like literally making our travel plans. We don't know what day of the week, but we know it will be heard the first week of October. That tells us, what we hope it tells us is that they're very serious about this issue. It's very timely, and they want to hear it as soon as possible so that they can issue a decision. It takes months to write the opinions and, you know, really decide who's going to join the majority opinion, who's going to write it, and whatnot. And so we're hoping that in very early 2018 we will have their decision. And that will be plenty of time, again, to have new maps before the 2018 elections.
There's lots of briefing going on right now. The state is spending a lot of money defending these rig maps. You've got the Attorney General's office, who has a Solicitor General. The legislature has already spent more than $2 million. They've authorized even more money just to hire lawyers to do amicus briefs because they're really fighting desperately to stay in control. We've hired Paul Smith to lead our Supreme Court team. He's now at the Campaign Legal Center, which is a nonprofit in DC that joined as a member of the legal team after the motion was dismissed, and they're now taking the lead on the Supreme Court phase. Paul Smith has argued in front of the Supreme Court 19 times. He's the lawyer who won Lawrence v. Texas, which was the first big gay rights case the Supreme Court ruled on, and he's been involved in some of the marriage equality cases. He's a very well-known Supreme Court litigator. We think our chances of success are very high. We are only asking the Supreme Court to uphold what a trial panel has already ruled, and that trial panel had 2 Republican-appointed judges and only 1 Democratic-appointed judge. So we think that we're in good shape. Now, let me just conclude with a couple of thoughts here. Our expectations should be realistic. We're not totally solving all the problems in the world. We'd like to be, but we're not totally solving all the problems in the world. There will still be some partisan gerrymandering, because what we've done is we've suggested there should be a standard, right, a limit. Hopefully, the extreme versions, being the worst in modern American political history, won't be able to happen. But elections still have to be won. And we were talking about this a little bit earlier, that it's actually really important to understand we want there to be less safe districts on both sides. We want the Democrats and the Republicans to have to fight for every vote. The more competitive districts there are, the better. That means the Republicans could still win 60 seats if they've got better candidates and better campaigns. But we want the Democrats to be able to have a chance to win 50 or 60 seats too, right? It should be fair. What will matter is shoe leather and hard work. Having good candidates who shower. Having good campaigns, raising the money, doing all those things. We need to promote a strong agenda on either side. The process under the case wouldn't change. The legislature would still be primarily responsible for drawing the map, but there would be a threshold where fairer maps would be very likely. Now, we want you to be involved, and I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, and he's going to talk a little bit about that after this slide, which is, I think, my last slide. So, legal cases are usually about watching the lawyers do their business, right? You're citizens. How can you be involved? It's really important that you understand that from the beginning, we had the intention of engaging the public. We want you to be engaged in this issue. We don't want it to be something that happens off in a courtroom, off in Washington. It's something that we want you to be engaged with. So the first thing you need to do is just hold those legislators accountable. Make this an issue that people are talking about. They can redraw these maps now in an open and transparent way if they choose to, right? The order's on stay, but they can still do it. And you should call on them to do it. You should write op-eds and letters there. You should call your legislators and say, let's move the ball forward, because this is the standard we want to hold our legislators to. We want you to support a bill that will make the process independent, which has been introduced. Jeff was actually one of the co-sponsors many years ago. It's called the Hansen-Vurig bill now, AB 44, SB 13. That would move the responsibility of drawing the map from the legislature to an independent body. The legislature would still have to pass the map, but the drawing would happen by an independent authority. We want you to hold the legislature accountable for wasting taxpayer money. we're up here in Eau Claire, but if you get down to Beloit, there's a paper called the Beloit Daily News. It is one of the most conservative newspapers in the state, probably in the Midwest. It's owned by a publisher who's a very, very right-wing guy. He loves Scott Walker. And I can't tell you how pissed off he is, how upset he is, that the legislature is wasting money defending these rigged maps. He thinks they can win elections on fair grounds, right? He doesn't want it to be fixed. And he's been very, very, very critical. That newspaper has been very, very critical. We want you to join that criticism. It's a bipartisan criticism. They could put that $2 million plus into a lot of other things. Don talks about this very well. And then we want you to organize your county board. And Jeff's going to talk about that a little bit. We've already done it here in Eau Claire, but in the surrounding counties, we want to do it because these county boards are often have a lot of really, small town conservatives, small town liberals, the folks who are the heart and soul of Wisconsin, right? Traditional Wisconsin. And people on both sides of the aisle are really upset about this rigging, and that's something that we want you to do. And then finally, I'm going to ask you to support the Fair Elections Project if you're willing. Somewhere in this mess, I've got some envelopes. You can go to the website. There's a ton of work that we're doing behind the scenes on communications with a national group and a statewide group, on citizen action, not the groups, but on moving people into action. And we're doing a lot of work on the amicus briefs to make sure that voices of people all over the country are being heard properly. So we ask for your support, and that is essentially our presentation.
So Sachin is pretty humble, and I just want to, every time I hear this
Nobody
story,
believes that.
he kind of is though. I actually didn't really hear how it got started until after the trial was over, and it reminds me that never doubt a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And that really gives me hope, because it was literally a handful of people who decided that this issue was important, and people would come into their conversation and have breakfast with them and say, "You're crazy, it'll never happen, you will never even file a case," or, "It sounds like a great idea, good luck, but I can't give you any time and energy or money." Jerry Hebert, who actually made our closing argument at trial, and I felt like I was in a movie, it was brilliant. He actually didn't even answer their phone call the first time. So they were very persistent, this small group of people who decided, we're going to do something about this thing. And you can't wait for someone else to fix it. You have to be part of the solution. And that's why I'm like, sure, I'll put my name on it against, the advice of my husband, who thought I was going to alienate half the population. And I said, you know what, if they care, they already know my politics. So you can do things. And we've learned that from this case.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Sue. We're so proud to have Wendy Sue part of this, part of our community. And Sachin, thank you for being here tonight. This has been, I know, very educational for you, and I'm going to give you a chance to answer some questions or ask some questions. But what I want to do at this moment is to add a little bit of burden on you, because this isn't going to happen if you're not a part of it. This isn't going to happen if I'm not a part of it. If they're not a part of it, it's going to happen because we all care. We all care. What I've argued often recently is that, my generation is to blame for this problem. And the reason I'm still standing here today is because I refuse to be part of a generation that is going to historically be called the least generation compared to our parents. I refuse to be part of that, and I hope you do too. We have to fix this. We have to fix this. And what you heard mostly tonight was about the Supreme Court case, which is examining the current maps, which were the most corrupt in U.S. history. But the U.S. Supreme Court isn't going to solve the problem for you. You're going to have to solve the problem. It comes down to our legislature having to change the law in how they redistrict. And we have that solution in the legislative docket. We have had it there when I was there, as a matter of fact. And I'll be the first to tell you that our leadership also was corrupted in the fact that they thought they were going to draw the maps. But I actually didn't listen to them when they said, don't push this any further. I had a hearing. I had a hearing on that bill. In the Capitol, a public hearing, brought in Mike McCabe. I brought in, Jay Heck with Common Cause. We had people come up and talk about what a problem this is and why it had to be changed, but that's as far as it got. That's as far as it got, and I admit that. But right now, we have a legislature that won't even have a hearing. They are so full of themselves and sure that they're going to hold on to this power that they have now created forever. They don't even want a hearing. But thank goodness we have people like Sachin and Wendy Sue who are out there making sure that the public are now starting to pay attention. And we got to push that even further. We're going to continue to have counties in Wisconsin pass this resolution. Our goal is 50 this year. I think, in fact, we said 50 by November 1st, right, Sachin?
Yeah, I'm not in favor of saying 50 publicly, but sure. I'm
saying-
hear that, Julian.
Because we're going to do that. We're at 19 right now, as of this afternoon, and we're going to get more probably in the next week, and we're going to get more and more and get that ball rolling. And that means we need your help in that. I know we're all over our county, but we all know people in other counties. So have them contact me, and I can get them the language, I can get them a guide to how to get this passed, and then it's actually, once it's introduced, it's a no-brainer. 21-4 in Eau Claire. It was 16-1 in St. Croix County. 16-1. This afternoon it was 16-2 in Milwaukee County. It's like that every time it comes around. So that's important. But what's important to us also, right here, we have the good fortune of us still having the chair of elections and campaign, because that was my position. But we still have the elections and campaign chair here in the Chippewa Valley, and that's Representative Bernier. And every time Representative Bernier appears somewhere, every time you get a chance of bumping into her, she needs to be asked, when are you going to have that public hearing on AB 44? We want that public hearing on redistricting reform. She needs to be asked that over and over and over and over. And you need to call her office and ask her over and over and over. Write her letters and ask her over and over and over. If she gets up and walks out of the room on you, on her way out, say it again. We need a hearing. And we need it now. Because, as Sachin finished up telling you, the Supreme Court case only takes us so far. And we need the solution, and we need it now. And we need it everywhere. And we need to follow that Iowa model, which, by the way, has been in place for 30 years. And they have yet to refuse the maps that the nonpartisan commission has drawn for. And it works well. It swings back and forth in Iowa. It works well. So that's the message I want to you to carry out of here. You have a burden. We all have a burden. But you know what? In the end, it's going to be so exhilarating when we win. Because when we win this fight, we're going to win a lot of fights. And we're going to save a lot of our future for our children and our grandchildren. Now, I know there's some questions out there probably of Sachin and of Wendy Sue or of myself. So this is your opportunity. I don't know if I want to let Steve ask this question, but here we go.
Would it make sense for us to send a personal letter? And can we send a personal letter to the Supreme Court on how this impacts on us, or does it really matter?
I never want to discourage anyone from having your voice heard, right? The process at the Supreme Court is a little bit more opaque. I can pretty much guarantee if you write a letter, the justices themselves and their clerks are not likely to see it. It's just going to be administrative staff. The way that citizens engage in a case like this is through something called an amicus brief. And so, for example, I'm working on a team in which the client is the League of Women Voters. And so if you're a member of the League of Women Voters, your voice is being heard through an amicus brief where the League of Women Voters has hired 2 lawyers, one of whom is working pro bono, one of whom is working for a reduced fee, to write a brief that talks about the policy impact on Wisconsin. there's another brief that Republican governors are doing. And Arnold Schwarzenegger, former governor of California, and John Kasich are kind of taking the lead on that. So they're speaking for that group. There's a brief for legislators. There's a brief for other interest group members. And so the reality is that what we think will have the most impact on this issue is writing op-eds and letters to the editor and letters to your legislator and calls to your legislators and keep the issue in the public eye, right? If there's a community that you live in close to here where you want to have a town hall and try to get 50 people in the room there, people would come. Wendy would be happy to come if it's up here, right? And other folks like Dan Dino and others would come. If there's a group of people online who would like to have more information, we can do something. And so the idea is just to kind of continue to expand the network. I've probably spoken in front of more than 1,000 people this year alone. And I tell you, when we started in 2013, it was hard to get 5 people to a meeting, right? And now I've talked to 1,000 people about this issue, and then they've talked to their friends, and they're talking about it online, and we're up to more than 50,000 people on our email list. And there's all this energy and engagement. We're on the front page of the New York Times, we're on the front page of the Washington Post. So that expansion of awareness, we think, is actually the most important thing as we look ahead past the case.
The other night, one of the objecting votes said that based on the Iowa format was the lines would be set by nonpartisans. As he said that there is nobody who is nonpartisan. So how do we answer that question?
Well, I'll tell you, there's 5 or 6 talking points, defensive talking points about why, oh my goodness, we should throw our hands up and these problems can't be solved. And you think these folks forget that we live in the greatest country on earth, right? And that we've kind of, we defeated Hitler. I mean, it's like the idea that we can't find solutions to these basic problems. I know that feels like a really big answer, but let me give you the simple. It offends me, right? That we can't possibly solve the problem. So there's a body, an agency that Jeff has dealt with called the Legislative Reference Bureau, and it is a state agency that's accountable to the legislature, and a bunch of professionals work there, including clerks and attorneys and just staff people. And they write the bill that implements a law, right? And so if you're a legislator, you go, I want to pass a bill that makes it illegal to paint crosswalks in white paint, I want you to paint it in yellow paint, right? So somebody has to write that language. And that's the Legislative Reference Bureau. And there's not a Democratic Legislative Reference Bureau and a Republican Legislative Reference Bureau. The same lawyers write the bills for the Democrats and the Republicans. And lo and behold, the Democrats trust them to do it, and the Republicans trust them to do it, right? There's a state budget office. There's a state Bureau of Labor Statistics. And there are nonpartisan professionals. Nobody's saying that they don't have some personal viewpoint, right? Everybody's got a personal viewpoint. Most people, even if they're in a nonpartisan job or an independent job, judges have personal viewpoints, right? But we trust them to be fair and impartial. We trust Julian here to write a fair story that he'll talk to the Republicans and he'll talk to the Democrats, and he'll say this is what we think, right, in this community. So the idea that we can't come up with a solution that's fair, when it's being done in California, when it's being done in Ohio, when it's being done in Iowa, it's nonsense, right? And it's an excuse. And I think that I get angry, I get outraged. And I think you guys should be outraged when you hear excuses. Because you don't put up with excuses from your 8-year-old. You don't put up excuses from your 15-year-old. I know I don't. You don't like it, but I don't put up with it. Let's not put up with excuses from these legislators who we pay with taxpayer money to do the people's business.
And I want to add that just from my experience as a legislator, there was no question. The Legislative Fiscal Bureau and the Legislative Finance, the people, they were beyond repute. Nobody ever questioned, just like Sachin said. These are the people you want to be doing this sort of thing. They are true professionals. They really, just like we're scientists in the DNR, right? They are there because they really believe in what they're doing, and it really matters to them.
Wendy?
I would add that another thing that I heard at the county board meeting was that it's not democratic to kind of outsource that writing, which you already addressed, but also the model is that after the maps are drawn, just like when legislation is written, then it goes to the legislature to actually vote on it. So it still is democratic. They still get to vote it up or down.
Before I ask my question, I want to let our presenters and everybody else here, that as familiar as I am with many of the items and the information that you presented, the way you brought the story together was wonderfully clear, and I really appreciated that. Thank you. The question I want to ask, I think, is primarily for Sachin, because it relates to the spreadsheet that you were talking about that seems so compelling in terms of indicating the outcomes that you were litigating against. And that research model sounds to me very, very much like something quite new called synthetic analysis that's being used in political science and economics. Another Stanford guy, John Donahue, just came out a couple of days ago with something based on that gets some wonderful reliability across states and large samples, just as you demonstrated here. And I'm wondering, even if this wasn't a synthetic analysis, it's so much like it that could you talk a little bit about what are some of the vulnerabilities of that analysis that might give the other side, what would we say, a prayer of chance?
So let me just, I'm not a political scientist or a lawyer, I'm just a dude.
That works.
So let me just clarify what I was saying. So Keith Gaddy, who is a very honest guy, a centrist, a professor at the University of Oklahoma, had a consulting business that he's now actually essentially stopped doing because he's so upset about what he did in Wisconsin. He looks back on it with regret. And he said so publicly. It's not a private conversation. He said that in the Daily Oklahoman, so I'm not outing him by saying that. He did this swing analysis, right? So I can't speak to the science. I'm not an expert. I can just describe how it was described to me as a layperson. But I also want to say that most of this was arithmetic. Okay, most of this was not a regression analysis or calculus or something fancy, right? This was just straight math, right? So when you take an average of performance, electoral performance in a particular census block or a particular district, I can tell you, because the data is in a spreadsheet, and I can just average the data, and I can say on that block, the average Democratic vote is 82%, and the average Republican vote is 18% for the last 10 years, or 20 years, or 30 years, or 40 years. And the trick is then to aggregate that data across a map, connect it to a GIS shapefile, and say, okay, now we've picked these census blocks, what will be the result in these scenarios, right? And if the vote swings this way, what will be the result? If the vote swings this way, and it really is just a very advanced form of arithmetic. And so, I'm sure there's some technical formula in terms of actually like running the number of calculations that he had to run, and that's where the expertise comes in. And I can really only speak to the conclusion, which is that they were confident, right? This is what's important. They were confident that they had drawn a map where the elections wouldn't matter. They believed it, and then we had the elections, and they were right. So there's a story that has been told that, I went into the 2012 election, and I'm a political guy, and I do campaigns, and I said, look, I think it's going to be tough for the Democrats to take the majority, but let's look at these seats and kind of look at what we know historically about, how Democratic Sheboygan is, or how, Republican Washington County is, or how Democratic Rock County is. And there was an expectation, well, the Democrats are going to pick up some seats. Because the polling leading up to the election, right, was that the Democrats were ahead. And then we had, you get the result of the presidential race and the U.S. Senate race first, because you're looking at big numbers, right, and you can kind of project. And so Obama won, and they called that, less than an hour after the polls closed, that Obama had won Wisconsin, right? And then Tammy won, and that actually didn't take very long either. I want to say it was 2 hours after the polls closed, right? And then we're getting results, assembly district by assembly district. And I remember the party, I was the chair of the Democratic Party in Washington County, so I was running an election night party with Gwen Moore and others in Milwaukee. And Gwen won, and she speaks, and we're looking at our phones, and we're getting the data, and we're like, oh, we lost that seat. Not surprised, we lost this seat. And you look at the aggregate data, get to midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, and you're like, man, we started the night at 60-39, and now it's 59-38 with 2 results outstanding. It turned out to be 60-39 again, right? And that's arithmetic. That's arithmetic. It's not a sophisticated, I should say it's sophisticated, but it's not, we could learn how to do it without an advanced math, right? It's just a question of executing a series of calculations over and over again.
And that makes it all the more impressive, what I
Yeah. Thanks.
And I'd like to pick up on that exact point, because we know now that there's topics of geo-targeting where businesses can get very, very precise about the characteristics of an individual, and that is based on the decisions of that individual. So that information is accessible through technology now, so that if we don't do something to prevent this now, this is going to get to the point where not only do we not have districts that are up for discussion, we won't have a voice, and it will continue to shut down. We must act now, because the window is very small that our voice will be able to overcome the momentum that is behind this. So not only the action on the outcome that we need, but we do really need to engage now and say, speak up. We want every voice to be heard. That is what democracy is all about, and we have to make that happen now.
Let me say three things. One, I'm glad Colin Rove was quoted on this. The poster child for all this nonsense is Texas. 2014, out of something like 36 congressional districts, I believe 3 were competitive. That's it. In other words, inside of 60%. The rest of them were slaughters. And they have it down to a much deeper science. But if you want to see what's going to happen to Wisconsin, keep your eye on Texas, no matter what. They're borrowing everything, every inclination from them. Second, Paul Clement is arguing.
He's just doing an amicus brief. He's not arguing.
I'm sorry?
He's just doing an amicus brief for the other side. He's not
Okay.
arguing.
Well, he's a pretty smart cookie. I taught him in high school. He's from Cedarburg, Wisconsin. He argued the other side in the Obamacare case. He argued the winning side in the Hobby Lobby case. He was a member of the legal team that on the winning side of Bush v. Gore. He became Deputy Solicitor General and then Solicitor General of the United States, and later acting Attorney General of the United States when Gonzalez pretty much forced out. He's a smart cookie. So we're up against some very smart people. But I want to ask you this question, Sachin. When you said that you did not believe that equal representation per district was constitutional, are you basically saying then that Baker v. Carr is done? I mean,
Baker v. Carr, Reynolds v. Sims, and a series of other cases were one-person, one-vote cases. And that was when the Supreme Court decided that every district in a particular area, whether it's a state or a county or wherever, that those districts had to be of equal population, that every vote had to count equally. And those cases are very important. I absolutely think they're important. I think the vast majority of people think that they're important. I've heard from a couple of, it's interesting, Gary Sherman, who's a judge in Madison from northern Wisconsin from Port Wayne, he actually doesn't agree with that because he thinks that they dilute rural power, but leave that aside. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is proportional representation. Proportional representation, the best example that I know of is the Israeli Knesset, right? And a lot of European governments work this way, where instead of voting for an individual candidate in a district, the national legislature is voted on by voting for a party, and the party is a slate, and whatever percentage of the vote they get, that's how many seats they get. That's proportional representation, right? So if you get 52% of the vote, you get 52% of the seats. If you get 10% of the vote, you get 10% of the seats. We have a district-based system in America. In England and Canada, it's a district-based system. And so that means that in your district, whoever gets a plurality of the votes wins. And everybody else is basically unrepresented in that district, right? And so it's never going to be proportional. In fact, it's going to be a little bit exponential. If your party gets 55% of the vote, you're probably going to get 70% of the seats because you're winning in so many places, right? And that also, there's a math law called Duverger's law. That's why we have a two-party system, right? Because when you have a district-based system, it's very, very mathematically difficult to organize in a way where you have more than two parties, unless you have very significant regional parties. It's the only reason why there's other parties in Great Britain is because they're regional parties. Nationally, there can only be two major parties. That's just it's a function of math, right? And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying have a district-based system, that's the fact. So we acknowledge that in the law. We don't think that the Supreme Court can rule that there must be proportional representation. If we get 52% of the vote, we get 52% of the seats. They're never going to do that. The law doesn't support that. We do think the law requires partisan symmetry, because partisan symmetry is the natural consequence of Baker v. Carr and Reynolds v. Sims. If every vote counts equally, if we all have equal protection under the law and due process under the law under the 14th Amendment, and if we also have the First Amendment right to have our opinion, right, which is what the First Amendment is really about, and you put those things together, that leads to a requirement that excessive partisan gerrymandering is wrong. And that is the argument that we put forward that the trial court accepted, that representational rights are burdened under the Constitution, under the First and 14th Amendment. And it's a natural outgrowth. It's actually very supportive of the concept of Baker v. Carr. Not bad for a non-lawyer, huh?
All right. I just have to thank you all for being here tonight. It's really important that you are, and it's important that we leave here and don't leave this behind. Take it with you and talk about it all the time. If you're interested in citizen action, this is my job. I have to do this part, or Judy will slap me. We have a brochure on the table. We have also a membership form on the table. It's really important that we continue to do what we do. And we're only just barely over a year old. We've already made some inroads on how to organize with low donor members. And low donor doesn't mean economically that you're a low economic person, but it means you're a $20 a month person that can get things done. We get things done. So consider that as well. If nothing else, contact me if you're just interested to find out what we are and who we are and what we do. That's my little ad as before you leave. But this, again, is the most important issue of the day of this country, and we're really glad that Sachin was here with us tonight. Thank you, Sachin.
I just want to put a plug. Obviously, we support the work of the Fair Election Project. Both Wendy and I are members of Citizen Action Co-op. She's a member of this co-op here in Western Wisconsin. I'm an original charter member of the first co-op in Milwaukee. It actually was a Citizen Action organizer 16 years ago. And so I'm a proud alum of Citizen Action, just following in my footsteps. So if you don't have a fact sheet yet, we have more up here. Please grab one. Thank you very much. Have a good night.